Welcome back to In the Studio with Kevin Savage, a podcast for producers. Today, as I said earlier, we are going to talk about, do you need third-party plugins? Do you need to spend hundreds of dollars on third-party plugins? Well, I think there's a simple answer to that. And, the simple answer is no. I don't think you need third-party plugins. Are they useful? Of course. Are they nice? Are they fun? Is it exciting to download or purchase and download that third-party plugin and see what you can do? You see those, people demonstrating them online and, on YouTube, and you hear people talking about them, and they've got packed full of all these, interesting features, but do you need them? No, you don't. I don't think you need them. Now, that's a pretty simplistic view of the question of, do you need third-party plugins? And ultimately, the real answer of whether you need them, I think, is a bit more complex. And that's kind of why I thought I would take this second episode and discuss it. Now, I think that whether or not you need them kind of depends on a few things. Number one, and we're going to address these, three things in order. And so here we go. Okay, so I think the first thing that you need to ask yourself, or you need to determine whether or not you actually need them, is what is your role? What exactly do you do? Are you a mixing engineer? Are you a mastering engineer? Are you an artist? Are you stuff like that? The second question that I think, the second question is, what kind of music do you produce? So assuming that you are a music producer, what kind of music do you produce? Or, assuming you are a mixing engineer, what music do you primarily mix? Or if you're a mastering engineer, what music do you primarily master? And finally, the third question, whether to determine whether or not I think you need third-party plugins, is, what is your production knowledge? So those are the three things. What is your role? What kind of music do you work on or produce? And what is your production knowledge? Now let's break those down. So the first question is, what is your role? As I said earlier, are you a producer? Are you a recording engineer? Are you a mixing master engineer? Because depending on those roles, that may determine whether having a third-party plugin is useful. If you are a producer and artist, having access to third-party plugins or third-party instruments, especially third-party instruments, I think third-party effects is, that kind of changes things up a little bit. But, specifically third-party instruments, Serum, Massive, FM7, FM8, I think they're really useful. Most DAWs have instruments available to you, such as Operator in Ableton, or Harmor, I think is what it's called. I don't use FL Studio, but I think it's called Harmor in FL. But having additional instruments or two that are third party, that could be really useful if you're an artist, Perhaps in the song that you're trying to make, you want, some really symphonic strings, or, some, deep, powerful horns or something like that. In that case, if you can't find samples that really fit those sounds you're trying to achieve, having a third-party plugin like Kontakt or something like that is useful. So depending on who you are, what you do can be really useful. And especially, I think, in a lot of cases, it can really get those creative juices flowing. But, it really isn't necessary. On my YouTube channel, I've done 2 videos on how to turn samples like animal noises, and I think I did. I sampled the HBO trailer to Chernobyl to show that, look, using stock plugins that you have, I use Ableton, so stock plugins in Ableton Suite, you can make some really cool sounds, and you can really turn something into something else, with FX processing and stuff like that. And you could do the same with for, instrumental. You can take, I've seen there's plenty of videos online of people taking a sample and flipping it and applying it to a piano roll and playing and making it a truly amazing drop or, a chorus or verse with the stock plugins in their DAW. And, so, that obviously shows you don't necessarily need them. And, that's going to get into like the next question here in a second, because I think, yes, in some genres, perhaps having third-party plugins is useful. We'll get to that in a second. Now, if you are a recording engineer, personally, I think the money is better spent because you could spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on plugins, buying all of the East West Quantum Leap libraries, buying all of Native Instruments stuff, buying all of FabFilter, buying all of Ozone, all that stuff, all of the UAD stuff at like $200 a pop. Over time, you're at like $10,000 by the time that you've acquired all of these plugins, and you're maxing out your hard drive space, to be honest. So, if you are a recording engineer, honestly, that money could be better spent in just better hardware. Better analog gear, better microphones, a better space, all of those like external, out of the box, out of the DAW sorts of things. And so, in that case, perhaps having, spending the money there is more useful than putting all that money into third-party plugins. Now, that being said, having access, especially if you're a recording engineer, you're recording a lot of vocals or something like that, Melodyne and Autotune can be really useful, especially if you are a UAD user and you have the Apollo or something along those lines. Having Autotune real-time can be really useful because there are some artists who will use Autotune as basically their instrument. And so in that case, yeah, if you're a recording engineer, maybe spending some money in a Melodyne so you can tweak those vocals and make them really nice, and you getting a good copy of Autotune and doing the same thing can be useful. So I'm not going to fault you if that's who you are and you're spending third-party plugins, but to the majority of people out there, I think even if you're a recording engineer, third-party plugins aren't necessary. Finally, if you are a mixing mastering engineer, even in that case, you don't necessarily need third-party plugins, but, it can be useful, and I get it, especially if that's what you do, because, there might be something that just doesn't exist in the DAW, and you need it for a more surgical mix or a surgical master and whatnot. In that case, yeah, I get it. I get why you might have that. Even in that case, for the mixing mastering engineers, especially the mastering engineers, possibly having that analog gear can be really useful, but I just don't think it is necessary, especially, by the time you get done with everything, you spent a bunch of money, your hard drive's maxed out, and then you start loading them on, and in many cases, these plugins just max out your CPU. So spend that money elsewhere, in my opinion. And honestly, all of the native, the native to the DAW plugins, a lot of the times are really light on the CPU. So, they're meant for the DAW itself. And, a lot of them, especially I think in Ableton, they sound really, really good. So that's my opinion when it comes to, based on your role, do you need them? Again, simple answer, no. It's a little more complex than that. But moving on to the second question, which is what kind of music do you produce? This just kind of reinforces a lot of what I just said, Now, I get it, and so, okay, so what kind of music do you produce? If you're a hip-hop producer, you probably don't even need them at all. Have a subscription to Splice, buy some sample packs, make some of your own samples, throw them on a piano roll, come up with a cool melody. You could build a pretty decent pad in like Operator or whatever the native instruments to the other DAWs are, to just kind of reinforce the sound. Your primary focus is that that main melody or whatever you've made with whatever sample you took and flipped. And your drums, most of the time you're going to probably buy sample packs for that or make them yourself, which is what I advocate for. And ultimately, you could be a hip hop producer and literally never touch a third party plugin because you just don't need them. Now I get it. In some cases, having those analog sounds that come from like a well sampled library, in Contact or what is it? What's the other one? I'm drawing a blank right now. Omnisphere. A lot of people like Omnisphere. I could see why it's really useful, and I can understand the reason why you'd be spending that money, but I don't think, especially if you're beginning and just starting out, I don't think you need it. And that'll get to the next point, production knowledge. But in a lot of cases, I don't think you need it. Now I get it. I think on the other hand, if you're someone who produces like dubstep or rhythm or electro house, I get it. Having third-party plugins can be very useful in that case because the music kind of necessitates it. I think that Ableton's making it easier to not need third-party plugins with Wavetable, because before that it was pretty much just Operator, and Operator you can do a lot of stuff, but it still kind of sounds a little thin. I think with layering other organic noises that you're taking from like you're downloading off Splice, I think you can really still reinforce it. But I get it. There's certain growl sounds that you may want and wave shapes that you just don't have access to, that you require you to have something like FM8 or Massive X or Massive or Serum. But ultimately, again, you can do a lot without third-party plugins. And so finally, what is your production knowledge? That's the final point in my the three questions to determine whether or not you need a third-party plugin. Honestly, listen, real talk, I am absolutely at fault of doing exactly the opposite of what I am advocating for. When I first started out, I was spending tons of money on plugins. I thought that every plugin I would buy would make me a better producer, would make music production easier, and all of that is not true. It is not at all true. It didn't start until I actually started trying to learn the native plugins in my DAW. Did I start to notice that my production knowledge just really got better. Because they're easy, they're straightforward, they're simple, and they sound good. And, as you start to make stuff and it starts to sound good, it inspires you to make more stuff, and it's just kind of the snowball effect. So, if you are a producer starting off, don't buy all of those third-party plugins. Buy an instrument or two. I'm not going to fault you for that, but you don't need all of the FabFilter plugins. You don't need all of the Native Instruments plugins, all of the Isotope plugins, all those everything. You don't need them. They're useful if you want to, toss a quick, easy master. But I mean, $5 and you can get Lander to do a quick master just so you can hear it sounding maxed out. Or, better yet, go on YouTube, find or reach out to me. I've got some mastering chains. If you're an Ableton user, I'll send it to you. Ones that I've made for my own mastering, you toss that on your master channel just for a quick and easy master, and boom, you're basically mastered, so that way you can hear what it sounds like, when it's all kind of raised to a much better level. You don't need those third-party plugins like Ozone and Neutron. Do they help polish a little here and there? Absolutely. And I think I'll mention a little bit of that, at the end, but you don't need them. Finally, so you don't need them. And I get it. Maybe in some cases you can't, like I said earlier, you can't find the right kind of organic sounds that you may want, even though you've combed through Splice and you don't have the money to buy like a specific sample pack for that. In that case, I get it, and I think when I mention my top 5, one of them kind of covers this end of the question of, well, what if I need, a good string section because I really want those sounds and I think they sound good and will really reinforce my song or will be great for like opening. Fine, but you don't need it to start out. Try it. Maybe try to focus in on learning that knowledge with what you have in front of you, and then work your way to that point. So yeah, yeah. Now, I'm going to put a little caveat, a little asterisk to my top 3. And I think I don't think you need third-party plugins. And I think this asterisk especially kind of says, if you have this, you don't need them at all. You don't even necessarily need the native plugins. If you are someone who is knowledgeable enough in a multimedia programming language like Max for Live or Reaktor, where you can actually build the plugins yourself, that just kind of kicks all of what I said out the window on the side of almost any of the stuff that I just brought up. Because if you know that kind of a language, if you know how to do Max for Live or Reaktor or stuff like that, if you're fluent in that sort of language and comfortable in that type of environment and have just this immense knowledge of signal flow and sound design, as well as plenty of time on your hands, you theoretically could do anything. You don't at all need third-party plugins. But I think that's unrealistic, which is why I have it as an asterisk. And I think it's important to kind of put it out there that there is these kind of programming languages that, theoretically you could learn. But I've sat down and tried to make some stuff, and I'll tell you what, it's not easy. I have several years of doing this and learning about these plugins. And I mean, it's not full-time knowledge, but those languages are tough. So that's kind of the caveat to everything. Do you need them? No. But in some cases, yes. If you know Reaktor, you don't need them like at all. You just don't. Because you could basically make anything. I mean, you might say, well, what if the organic sounds? And it's like, okay, so maybe that's the caveat to the caveat. That's the second asterisk, unless you need organic sounds for whatever you're doing. But more often than not, if you know that, you don't really need any of that because you can create it. So I mean, the bottom line is third-party plugins, while not necessary, can be useful. And personally, I find that pushing native to the DAW, FX, and instruments to their limits is much more fun and fulfilling. Also, it's easier to share with other people. If you and a collaborator are both working in Ableton, maybe the collaborator doesn't have all the plugins you have, and rather than having to freeze everything, you could just share it. And you don't need to worry about that. And especially, getting good at processing, resampling again, twisting, pulling, warping, all these things can really just makes you a better producer, because you could hear that sound in your head and recreate it. You don't need to dig. You can just make it. And that is such a fun once you get to that point, it's making music and sound design is so much more fun because you hear how things change and you grow and ideas come and form and stuff like that. And it's a really great feeling. Now, as I said, if you are interested in what third-party plugins or bundles I would recommend, at the end of this podcast, in the final thoughts section, I will give my top 5 plugins / bundles that I recommend. So don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back, and we'll get in some music news.